In this chapter, we will talk about a different kind of King's Indian structure. King's Indian structure type 2, the author calls it. It's similar to the previous chapter. The central pawns were the same, but now there is a set of pawns on c4 and c5. And this is quite a major change. Black is sort of trying to have the best of both worlds here. He wants to keep the c-file closed, he wants to keep the queen side closed, but also not to give white this overwhelming space advantage, was his pawn on c7. Black is sort of dreaming of typical King's Indian counterplay with g6 and f5, but sometimes also with Benoni counterplay with a6 and b5. So if phrased like this, it's not too difficult to see the black potential, right? I mean, you are much less lost on the queen side than in a normal King's Indian, but you have your typical counterplay. And, well, the price, you can argue, is that the pawn on d6 is weak. There's no protection from c7, but that's not too relevant a factor. To talk about the downsides, well, we should look at what is white trying to achieve in this position. For white, the strategic objectives had changed considerably more than black. In a normal King's Indian, well, we are pushing c5, but that's illegal now. So the obvious addition white has gotten is that, well, there is the possibility of playing a3 and b4 to try and break through on the king's side. And the downside of having played the move c5 is that, well, b4 comes with quite some added force. It's easier for white to open files against a pawn on c5 than if it's on c7. Black is arguing that when white breaks through, it's not as decisive, but it is easier to open the b file like this, no doubt. But there is one more option that's perhaps a bit more deceptive. But the white advance of f4 gains in strength, and it gains in strength because the d6 pawn has been quite weakened. Quite often, let's say that if black goes e takes f4 and white takes back with a bishop, there will be immediate counterplay against the d6 pawn. So when white goes f4, well, very obviously it leads to an exchange here, and then it's going to be very defining who will get control of the e5 square. Well, if black can control the e5 square comfortably, he's doing obviously fine. But there will be times when it's white who has control there, and it's going to be very unpleasant. Well, we have seen similar things in Benoni structures, and this is half a Benoni structure, right? So this general type 2 King's Indian structure is interesting. It's more solid for black, and it has some potential. But the author says in general we can talk about white being slightly better here, and I think that's a fair assessment. So it's not a dream scenario for black in a King's Indian, but it's a very viable option, and we will go into it into more details in the chapter. The author separately discusses this scenario when white takes on f5 and black takes back with the pawn on f5. In general, perhaps it looks like, again, a dream scenario for black, right? I mean, you have gotten these two strong central pawns, and it looks like very attractive. But this is not at all always the case. Actually, taking on f5 is a very respectable white strategy. And, well, the nice thing for black, of course, is that, well, you know, the G file has been opened. Quite often we can get a rook there in the King's Indian. And these two pawns will both have direct influence or can move forward in an attacking fashion. But if we look at it from the white perspective, we also start understanding the downsides. First of all, white can play the move f4. And when you play the move f4, suddenly this pawn that, well, theoretically have some kind of central influence gets stuck on f5. Very often black would have to play the move e4 himself, but then somehow the dynamic of the black position starts disappearing, and the e3 square, even sometimes with a knight going in this direction, can become very, very powerful. I also remember in my youth, Bent Larsen was arguing that in this position, well, the maneuver a4 and rook a3 was quite relevant. There is actually sometimes when the computer thinks so, but to sort of call it a very generalistic themes is too much, but Larsen was very good at spotting the extraordinary. So, yeah, it makes sense debating this, and I think what makes sense is understanding that this is nowhere near as good as it seems for black. Well, I mentioned the move f4. At times, you can also just play the move f3, and then somehow you keep these 2 pawns in check. It's difficult for them to move forward. And, well, if white does it well, maybe a knight on c3 and a bishop on d3, it's going to be hard for black to sort of, well, developing naturally. There will be times maybe you can sacrifice a pawn with e4 and you take something jumps to e5, but it's really going to depend on circumstances. So it's important to grasp that while this structure looks incredibly beautiful for black, it's not at all always the truth. On the contrary, white has quite some interesting play in this structure. We are starting off this chapter with a strategical masterpiece by Wojtaszek playing against Fyodorov in 2012. This composition looks very complicated, and well, it is. Nothing has been exchanged yet, and black has just played the move knight to g4, obviously wanting to follow up with the typical break f5. White could, of course, start chasing the knight, but it's just going to retreat to the h6 square, where actually it's quite well placed, even helping the f5 advance. So Wojtaszek chooses just to develop normally. He plays the move bishop to b2, and black follows up with the move f5, of course. Now, white has to figure out, well, what is he going to do next? And, well, I guess black could be threatening the move f4. Somehow this would grab extra space on the king side and have some kind of long-term attack. The typical way for white, of course, would be to play on the queen side. Let's say a3 threatens b4. But black can play the move b6, and after b4, knight b7. Of course, this knight on b7 looks weird, but it is actually very helpful in defending the queen side. It looks towards the c5 pawn and the d6 pawn. And it's going to be pretty hard for white breaking through in a relevant manner in a somewhat speedy fashion. And black's hope then is that he would create a lot of counterplay with the move f4 in the meantime. So in this position, white does this, to me, illogically looking move, at least at first sight, but it's very strong. He takes on f5. And now, well, black takes back with the g-pawn, and it, well, we debated in sort of the previous introduction, but these pawns, in general, look very strong, and it looks like now black has gained control in the center. But white starts pushing black back. He plays the move h3. You could make a case for going to h6, but with f6 available, actually that is looks like an even better square. And now comes the move f4. This is sort of fighting back for space. And there is also the threat of f takes e5, which would lead to a very difficult structure for black. So Fyodorov plays the move e4, by far the most logical and the typical move. You could also consider taking on f4. From a positional point of view, maybe white would like to play the move rook takes f4, sort of keeping two beautiful pawns. But this would lead to massive counterplay like this. This bishop gets activated on e5 with d4, and the knight starts threatening towards g3. A much stronger move is playing the move g takes f4. It's true that now white also has a weak pawn on f4, like black has on f5. But it has a very stabilizing effect. And, well, it's more likely that it's white who's going to get a rook to the g-file attacking in this direction, that black would be able to attack in the g-file. I think especially this bishop on g7 is very much in the way of a black attack in the g-file. So g takes f4 is a move worth noting. That's quite typical in this structure, actually. So Fyodorov goes e4. Wojtaszek continues in extremely exemplary fashion. He plays the move knight to d1. it wants to jump to the e3 square, and the e3 square is very beautiful. It attacks the pawn on f5, it starts preparing for g4. A key theme in, maybe not so much in this structure, but in this position in general, is this knight on a5. It's very much out of play, and I think one should be a little bit too careful about generalizing too much on this game, because with the knight on a5, it's very specific. I mean, put this knight on, let's say, g6, probably black is just doing very well. But the knight is on a5. Black goes queen to e8, also very logical, right? We are trying to transfer the queen to g6 most likely, and it will start attacking sort of vulnerable squares in the neighborhood of the white king. Wojtaszek preempts that. He goes king to h2. Fyodorov plays queen g6. And, well, the author says maybe it would have been more exact to play the move knight to e3 now, but Wojtaszek plays rook f2. Now it's a choice for black what to do next. Very logically, it would be to get counterplay in the g file, attacking the g3 pawn, which is somewhat weak and also not that comfortable to defend. So he plays the move king to f7. A mistake, but we'll talk more about that later. Now, knight e3 happens, rook to g8, and now rook g1 has become possible. I guess it looks very passive, right? You're really going to put a rook like this, just defending this pawn. It's going to look even more ridiculous in a while, because after bishop h6, Wojtaszek plays the move bishop to h1. And this position, I think it's worth appreciating a little bit. I think at first sight it looks not too bad for black, but there is huge potential, and I think it's a lot is connected with this knight on e3, and of course the break g4. Yeah, maybe he could have played, let's say, rook a8 instead of what he does, but it doesn't seem to make any particular difference. Fyodorov plays the move b6. It's a useful move, sort of defending this knight so it doesn't suddenly fall, but also knight b7 retreat could be possible at some point. But here, Wojtaszek plays the seemingly impossible move g4, and after black takes it, there is the threat of g3, and taking back on g4 immediately, well, black can just take back. He has some more pieces covering the square. But after the move rook g3, the game is practically speaking over. I mean, till now, it looked like a normal sort of regrouping battle for both sides. But this is positional bankruptcy for black. Rook d3 is such a beautiful move. It just covers it makes it impossible for black to play the move g3, and there's just no solution whatsoever to bishop takes f6, followed by taking on e4 and g4, with a complete collapse of the black position. Fyodorov tried to fight on, but it's over already. So Wojtaszek very trivial takes on f6, now takes on e4. The queen has to go, and then knight takes g4. White now has an extra pawn, so Fyodorov tries to fight a little bit, takes on g4, takes, queen h4 check, rook h3, queen takes g4. But after knight g5, bishop takes g5, queen takes h7, he had to resign. The point is that after, well, rook g7, you can take on g5 with check, and you're going to take the rook next, and, well, it's a completely hopeless situation. An incredibly beautiful game by Wojtaszek. I think this position after rook g3 is almost like a piece of art, right? White has sacrificed a pawn, but is strategically winning. And I also think the move bishop h1 makes a huge impression. I mean, this quiet retreat, just getting ready for g4, and basically the black's position cracks. But, well, this is not the full truth. This is a very, very beautiful game by Wojtaszek. But the author starts arguing, well, how could it then have ended up so badly? Is it really such a hopeless structure for black? And the answer is no. He gives the suggestion that in this position, well, black played the move king to f7, but this was obviously underestimating the importance of getting this rook to g1. Now we know that. So in this position, well, we would suggest to play the move knight to h5. This threatens queen takes g3 check. And if you go knight to f1, well, now this rook is not going to end up on g1 easily. So black can play something like, let's say, rook f7. And the author suggests a line like this: exchange, rook to g7, sort of renewing the threat on g3. It's true that after bishop h1, you cannot take on g3 due to rook d2, but you can just play king to f7 and then bring the other rook to g8, and actually black has a very nice position. It's extremely hard to get through the g4 break, especially because f4 is weak if you do so. So black is doing very well with his activity in the g file. So knight h5 would have been a nice move, which then leads to the idea that, well, perhaps rook f2 was not really necessary. You should play in a more dynamic fashion. Let's say something like knight to e3, and if you go knight h5 now, you can apparently break with g4, says the computer, because if you take like this, you can play the move f5. And, well, it seems the tactics are good for white here. Similarly, you could have argued that even here, the move king h2 is actually not good. The author says that knight e3 is a much better way of doing it, because after queen g6, we're not going to go king h2. We are actually going to release the potential energy in the position with g4 already. The point being, if it takes, then f5 is very strong. And it's not like black is not, well, black is winning a pawn, but white is getting it back. And the problem here is that, well, white is just going to exchange on g4 and now it undermines the e4 pawn, right? So whatever black does, let's say bishop takes f5, we will exchange on f6 twice, and we will take on e4. And in this position, while perhaps it looks not too good for black for white because of this pin, reality is that this knight is very much out of play, and we're gonna exchange something, and it's gonna be much more awkward for black than for white. And the computer says white is much better here. So we are, again, sort of the pendulum is swinging. Is it white who is better here? Not really, because queen e8 apparently is quite a mistake. It looks tempting to put the queen on g6, but it seems misplaced there, actually. So queen e7 would be a good move. And the point is that, well, if you go knight to e3, then knight h5 suddenly becomes very relevant. A huge difference is that now, well, if you take on g7, we can just take back with the queen, which, well, attacks in this direction as well. So after queen e7, the computer says black is fine. And, well, from the author's perspective, that seems to be the end of, let's say, the evolution train of thoughts to concluding that black is okay. But modern computers think very differently. In this position, well, knight d1 is a universally praised move. It's really supposed to that this is how you play in this kind of positions. You play knight d1 to e3, you play bishop to c3, this knight is weak on a5, and eventually we're going to play g4. Well, we've just seen Wojtaszek do this in a brilliant fashion, and it's really how you're supposed to do. But computer thinks differently, and the computer suggests a move or a plan I have never seen in this structure before. Say that after rook a e1, white is just much, much better. The very basic idea is that they are just going to smash through on e4. Knight h5, for instance, computer says knight ce4, bishop b2, queen b2. And after this exchange, the simple claim is that these two pawns are much more relevant than this knight on a5. Simply, white is going to push forward. Well, the threat is f5 followed by g4. Computer says maybe bishop f5 is the best defense, but now a nice move, bishop to f3, attacking on h5. And after this retreat, white can even play the move knight to f2, and he's just going to follow up with g4 and f5. And, well, there's nothing reasonable black can do. You can try a counter-up track like this, but after g4, bishop b7, f5, bc4, knight e4, despite only having one pawn for the piece, it turns out that the threat of f6 is really massive, and black is in serious trouble here. Similarly, after rook a e1, well, you could make a case for h5, sort of containing the g4 break, but white is going to hide his king, and let's say king h2, b6. The computer already says bishop takes e4, fe4, knight ce4. Again, is a very strong piece sacrifice. Never seen anything like this before, but, well, who am I to argue against modern computers? But it's fascinating, and my best guess is that I have left you completely confused, right? Because I'm telling you this is great for white, no it's not, yes it is, and so on and so forth. And, well, the honest truth is it's also very confusing for me, but I thought we managed to incorporate a lot of interesting and typical ideas in this line, and also this very new piece sacrifice. And while it is messy, it's a messy position. I think one has to be able to see what is good for white, what is good for black, and then try and incorporate it in the way that's favorable for oneself. But I think a fascinating position and an incredibly impressive game by Wojtaszek, but of course also this piece sacrifice for the computer makes a huge impression. Our next game again is Casper Pirun against Tiger Hilap Persson. Tiger is a very interesting character on the chess circuit. He's beaten me several times with black in the King's Indian, but I also managed to beat him a couple of times. He really lives on the edge, and he likes as much complexity as one can get. Here he's played the move c5, and that leads to our structure, and is also very typical of Tiger, because, well, of course, black could go for an immediate attack, but Tiger is not afraid of having more long-term plans. And here, well, we get our sort of mentioned structure where black is trying to combine having more solidity on the queen side with still having a potential of attack on the king side. White's problem is what to do next, and, well, Pirun does it very logically. He plays the move a3, and after b6 follows it up with b4. I mean, white just wants to gain space on the queen side and ideally open some lines. But black is staying solid here, and it's not that easy for white. So Tiger plays the move f5. And this leaves the question, what should white do next? Pirun ends up sort of on the wrong track, and the author says probably going rook b1 would be better. Let's say knight f7, bishop f2, bishop to h6, and probably white should play the move a4, he says. I mean, the idea is that you want to break even sort of more open things with the a5, and should black choose to play the move a5 himself, then white can do something like this, and perhaps, queen b3 would be nice to go to b6, but then the knight is hanging on d2. Maybe in this position, actually, white should go knight b3 and sacrifice on c5. And, with the pawn on being on a5, there will be bishop b6 and c5 later with a very complicated position. This would be more typical in a way. But what Pirun does is he takes on c5, and then he goes queen a4, sort of hoping to, maybe play knight b3 next and get to the a5 square, or at times also, he keeps this knight at bay at g8, else queen c6 could happen at times. It's a quite typical way of doing it, but it really works out pretty badly in this specific position. Tiger goes bishop d7, there is a repetition of move a couple of times, and while it's not a given Tiger would have liked the draw, normally he really tries to play for a win, it's Pirun who sort of takes the responsibility and sort of jumps out of the repetition by playing the move queen to b5. Tiger drops his knight back to f7, and white continues with his idea knight to b3. Was white to move, he would either go knight a5, and the knight can jump to the c6 square with sort of forcing favorable exchanges, and perhaps you could even take back with the d-pawn at some point. But there is also the idea of doing the move queen to a5 next. Exchanging queens would be nice, and let's say queen a5, if black goes queen to d7, maybe we can jump with knight b5 entering the c7 square. But all these points starts becoming irrelevant after Tiger's reply. He plays the move a5. And basically, he keeps this huge solidity on the queen side. That sort of, is the whole point of this structure, right? It's very, very hard for white to break through in a non-violent way. Quite often, you would end up sacrificing on c5. But in this particular instance, let's say takes, black will play g5, and after bishop f2, was this pawn on f4? Maybe white's position would be decent, but here you can play the move knight to g6. The knight is threatening to go to f4. You can play g4 next, opening things on the king side, and black just has an extra piece with white not having sufficient compensation at all, I think. So after a5, Pirun chooses to go queen to a4. He wants to have the knight to be able to sort of on the b5 square. Tiger plays bishop h6, intends sort of to give a check on e3. Pirun prevents it, and after bishop d7, knight b5 comes a very nice move, typical of the King's Indian. Knight to g8. it can look a bit slow, but the knight is going to end up on this nice square on f6, where it both sort of puts more pressure on the e4 square, but just as well wants to jump to h5 and perhaps even further to the f4. White is just not set up at all for this regrouping. This two knights and the queen on a4 is so far away from the action. One thing is that they're not breaking through on the queen side. That is bad. But also they're not positioned well at all to sort of help stopping the white attack. So basically this is a very desperate situation for Piron. He took on f5, Tiger took back, knight c1, at least trying to, well, get the queen back, right? So knight f6 happens, queen d1, rook g8. We will just show the next moves, just mainly in sort of honoring Tiger for his creative attacking play. But black is already strategically winning here. Knight c3, knight h5 joins the attack. Now the queen comes, and after g3, queen to h4, there starts being this direct threat of knight takes g3. Piron sort of plays king g2, but it actually doesn't defend against the threat, because so Tiger takes, and now rook to g8, basically threatening to take on g3 next with mate, queen e1, and then after f4, there's no reasonable way. You could play the move knight to e4, but then after bishop h3 check, king g1, f2, g3, there is the threat of bishop e3, for instance, and there's also the threat of, let's say, something like bishop g2, followed by queen h2 mate. So a completely hopeless situation. The game goes rook to h1, and after rook takes g3, well, he gives up the queen, but that's completely hopeless, like this bishop h3 with huge material loss. But in this position, if you go king f2, then there is the nice move rook to h3, and if king g2, you have queen d5 check, and well, I think, yeah, the game is like this, and then it's going to be mate on h1. So, well, a hopeless situation for Piron, who lost shortly. A great attacking game by Tiger, and I think also it gives a good illustration of the potential of this sort of solidity black has here. I mean, we saw white attacking on the queen side, but it's not always very convincing, and white was actually not close to breaking through here. So I think after the first game, it was good with a comeback for black here to balance things out. There will be times when after white takes on f5, black is going to recapture with a piece, most likely the bishop from c8. In general, this is a very dangerous strategic situation for black. The problem is the e4 square. Well, imagine a white knight on the e4 square. No longer can black play the move f5 and eject it from e4. And on e4, it's attacking the weak pawn on d6. The knight on e4 on such a square can basically be a monster. To make this at least moderately playable for black, black has to be able to contest the e4 square. And to do that, he needs to keep knight and the light squared bishop to contest this knight. So, I mean, this bishop on c8 should really not exchange itself for its white counterpart. That will just mean that the e4 square is gonna belong even more to white. But in general, when you see this structure with white, you should think, great, I have control of the e4 square, I would be positionally better. And with black, there should be danger signs all over that this is a very, very dangerous strategic situation. And if you have to end up it in any kind of way, make sure that you have pieces that can sort of attack the e4 square, at least to try and make sure you don't end up in this horrible scenario with this knight dominating on e4. Yeah, this is, again, it comes with a huge warning from black. There is exceptions. We will later in a chapter see when black actually managed to navigate something similar. But in general, this is a very dangerous structure for black. This example is more or less a horror story from black. He was forced to take back on f5 with a bishop, and now white can just exchange the light squared bishops, and he has the full control of this e4 square with a knight. He doesn't even have to occupy it immediately. He has time to regroup and make the black position even more miserable. This beautiful maneuver, bishop to f2. Black is not threatening the move g4 because we can just take it, and this gives white some sort of free space to maneuver. The game goes knight to g7 and now bishop to e3, and we get to see sort of white ideal sit-up. This bishop attacks the bishop on h6. It's not at all the idea to exchange it. On the contrary, what white wants to do is to make this bishop on h6 as miserable piece as possible. Black tries to move rook f6, perhaps dreaming of playing g4 and then forcing this mentioned exchange. But now white plays knight e4, and after rook g6, a very strong move. He plays g4. I guess that it's possible to have this sort of idea that g4 is weakening in front of your own king. But white has way much control for that to matter. I mean, these two pieces are so superior than the knight and bishop here. And, well, there is nothing black can do to start any kind of counterplay. On the contrary, this pawn on g4 completely blocks these pieces. There's no activity happening for black ever anymore here. He tries sort of targeting the pawn on g4, but white just protects it like this. Black brings in the rook, the king goes up, and after knight to c7, a nice move, knight to g3. It starts threatening towards h5, and when black plays h4, white happily goes back, and having sort of even completely absorbed this tension, with the pawn now being on h4. So black has zero prospects here. All black can do is to try and hold the fort as much as possible. Knight c8, queen to d3, knight king f7, and well, black is doing it a little bit cleverly. He's setting it up in terms of trying to exchange twice on e4, at least to get rid of this knight. So, well, the question is, what should white do next? But it's extremely obvious here. It's just about opening fires on the queen side. So b4 happens, b6, and now b takes c5. If white takes with the d-pawn, I think our author suggests that bishop takes c5 is a good move, and that's very much true. But I just want to add as well that you could play the move a4 and you are strategically winning. There's nothing stopping a5. That will just open files on the queen side. b6 is going to be weak, and should black choose to play a5 himself, well, then the b6 pawn is extremely weak. You can just go rook b1 and you will pick it up quite easily. So black takes back with the b pawn, but then the white position more or less plays itself. It's doubling in the b file. Rook b1, rook b8, and rook eb1 here. And black actually resigned in the game. Simply, well, the position is too depressing. I would argue that literally all the white pieces are better than the black counterparts. Yeah, there's nothing to do here. The author decides to analyze a little bit further, but mainly to show a beautiful tactical trick. He suggests knight e4, knight e4, queen f7 to have counterplay against f3, but then he points out that rook takes e8 actually is possible. His point being queen f3, king h2, rook takes e8, rook f1, and the queen is surprisingly trapped on f3. Yeah, that's a nice little tactic or a little bit of chess humor, you can argue. But the main point is, well, this position, that we're not talking about a King's Indian with black being slightly worse. We're talking about a strategically completely lost position due to especially the e4 square, but also, as we saw, this nice maneuvering of the bishop here. So there's a huge difference in, let's say, the value of the pieces. And while this structure keeps the queen side somewhat solid, we can see that, well, white has play on the other side, and here it does not work at all to black's advantages. So, I mean, this idea of not taking back on f5 with a pawn comes off to a very bad start here. Here we have an example where it looks at first sight like black actually has a pretty decent version of our structure. This has the solidity as we discussed, but you could argue that these knights on e7 and d7, don't they look flexible? I mean, black can start playing for f5 quite soon. But realities are quite different, actually. After the move a3, the game went castling b4. And black started to realize that, well, again, this structure mainly has defensive purposes. Should black play f5 here, for instance, well, then knight g5 becomes incredibly strong. It just eyes this square on e6, and there's no reasonable way to defend it. In the game, he plays the move a6, but that's really settling for an extremely passive strategy. The author is critical about that, but also says, Well, to be honest, there's no particularly good way to go around it. The game continued rook b1, and now the black point was that at least he secured the c7 square without being harassed by a knight from b5. The problem is that, well, still, this is, it is moving things in the direction away from the king side. So the black idea for counterplay becomes even less realistic. And again, if you do f5, knight g5 is going to lead to immediate disaster and connection with the e6 square. So black played the move rook e8, just being sort of ready for a very, very long defensive sort of fight. Now white plays the move queen b3, focusing attention on the queen side. And this is quite reasonable. But it's very interesting that the computer actually suggests another move which it thinks is even better. And the move is king h1. And I guess it's reasonable to wonder, well, what is the point of that? But after b6, the idea is rook to g1. This construction. It looks very weird. But the idea is to follow up with g4, grabbing space on the king side. And it's not grabbing space in the sense of, I want to mate black. No, it's grabbing space in the sense of, we don't want you to get any counterplay with f5. And we are the one controlling the king side as well. And this means your position is going to be strategically worse on both flanks, and you're really going to have no counterplay whatsoever. It's a very interesting concept. You could argue that playing something like g4 weakens the king's position a bit. But the problem is that the white has so much space, and there's really no black pieces, even close to the white king on h1, so it does not matter at all. So this would be a very interesting strategy, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with what white is doing with queen b3 either. Black chooses to go b6. You can again say he's keeping this solid structure, and I think it's more sort of, there's nothing else than rather that he would like to do it. If you play f5, again, knight g5 is an immediate disaster due to the e6 square. And let's say if you try to prepare f5 with h6, then after bc5, knight takes c5, queen b6, the black position basically collapses. Well, you have to exchange queens on b6, but then something is hanging on d6 next, and should you go rook d8, well, you can just, for instance, play like this and play knight a4, and, well, your structure is hopeless and you will draw a pawn immediately. So black chooses to play b6 and says, okay, I'm just going to defend. That is probably the best there is in the position, but it also sort of means that the strategy has kind of failed. The King's Indian is a double-edged opening, but black very much goes for counterplay. And playing the King's Indian just to try and box out and be solid makes little sense. Then there is much more solid openings available that has a more sort of sound general structure. The King's Indian is designed for counterplay, and if there's no counterplay, well, then you've probably done it wrongly. So, rook fd1, h6. We're going to fast forward a bit. Now f5 is coming, so white is just backing like this. Bishop b7, I guess, looks horribly wrong. In general, it's said that this bishop in the King's Indian should be on c8, having sort of influence towards the white king side. The problem is that black is lacking a move now. You would generally like to develop with knight f6, but then after bc5, you cannot play bc5 because there is queen takes b8 in this position. So generally, it's extremely hard to mobilize in any way for black. And, well, these knights, as we described in the beginning as beautiful knights, in reality, makes the black position somewhat stuck. They're just standing there, but the black position is not communicating or regrouping well. He tries to move bishop b7, but it's obviously very sad. White plays knight a4, eyeing sort of bc5, followed by perhaps entering on the b6 square, and black plays the move bishop to a8. Now comes some regrouping for a while, and I will just fast forward to this position, with white playing the move bishop to d3. This is a very nice concept. He's trying to create pressure in this long diagonal. Well, black can obviously just play the move f4, and then there is no pressure whatsoever. But this is exactly what white is trying to provoke. Black tries to resist a little bit with rook f8, and then comes another interesting sort of maneuvering decision by white. He triples in the b line. And the idea with this is that now, well, we can see there is the threat of taking on f5, but you can no longer play the move rook b8, because then, well, you also need to have control of the b7 square. So basically now, white has put sort of combined threats in the b file with threats against f5, only to force the typical move f4. The question is, why is white doing that? Well, generally, this is a typical move f4. The problem is in this position here that, well, normally there would be a good bishop standing on c8, controlling this long diagonal. This is not the case at all now. No, this bishop is an a8, and this gives white an interesting opportunity. He plays the move bishop f1, and after queen d8, the move g3. Now this bishop is going to go to h3. It's obviously going to be a very strong bishop. Compared to this bishop on a8, that does absolutely nothing. This is strategic, completely a disaster for black. Game goes obviously on a bit, and now white finally starts to open things. He gets control of the b file. There's no, I mean, you cannot protect the b7 square and at the same time keep the c8 knight under control. So he has to exchange, and well, in this position, there is this funny tactic, rook to b8. The point is that if you take it, then after queen b8, there's a threat on c8. And if you try protecting c8 in any way, you're going to lose the rook on a7. But this is sort of very, very trivial. The game, was bishop f8, and well, exchange like this. It doesn't matter much. White wins in a beautiful manner, but I think for our perspective, this is nice. And now there is checkmate like this. But well, it was a nice game by Mareko and with a beautifully calculated ending. But for us, I think the main lesson was, well, understanding the huge strategic risk there is in this kind of structure. It's Black is playing a little bit too much on both sides. He's trying to keep his structure very solid, while at the same time hoping to play a King's Indian. But it's somehow, either you play a King's Indian and you play it fully, or you play something solid. There is times when this works very efficiently, but especially these two knights, as we saw, actually got completely stuck there, and somehow they don't seem to be positioned well for communication in the black position. I think perhaps, this king h1 is a story on its own, going for rook g1 and g4. This is an interesting theme. I think, of course, we should also pay attention to the constant worry of the knight jumping to g5 and attacking the e6 square, which means f5 is difficult to achieve. And then, well, in general, white just played a very, very beautiful strategic game. I think this idea of bishop d3, forcing black to play f4, is very noteworthy. And of course, there was a beautiful doubling in the, sort of not doubling, but tripling in the b file was noteworthy. But in general, we can see that black is so passive that white could more or less enforce any kind of beautiful positional concept on him, because the black position was so horrible. So maybe enough torture for black in this position, and we move on to the next game. Our last game in this chapter is Tsatsikerian against Satya Pragyan. And it's a very nice sort of model game for white. Here it starts as a check Benoni, but the pawn structure is exactly the same as in this chapter. The bishop on e7 makes the black position perhaps even more solid. But as we sort of gotten around to that, well, just being solid is not really enough in this structure. There is kind of long-term problems, or as we will see in these games, also mid-term problems. Black starts a typical maneuver here. He plays the move knight to e8, and after castle, the move g6. He wants to develop with a knight on g7, where it covers both the e6 square, but also helps the advance f5. It sounds nice, but it doesn't work out that greatly. So bishop to h6, knight to g7, queen d2, and now another integral part of the black plan. He plays the move king to h8. At first it looks weird, but after rook a1, we see the idea. He plays knight f6, and he wants to eject this strong bishop on g7. Tsatsikerian just plays h3, and after knight to g8, the move bishop to e3. And in general, black is getting really what he wants in this setup. He's gotten rid of the strong bishop on h6, and now he's ready to play the move f5. It all sounds great, and well, this is really how I was brought up, but this is the exact setup you should aim for in the Czech Benoni. Well, that was how I was taught chess 25 to 30 years ago. The problem is that, well, it is wrong. White just plays the move f4, and actually black has a very horrible situation here. I mean, the computer says like plus 1.5 at this point. The problem is that, yeah, black has done a lot to set up f5 counterplay, but f5 is much more of a weakening move, actually. There's just no, well, solidity in the black position. I mean, well, I mentioned the problem is that in such structures, it becomes a struggle for the e5 square, but these knights are very far from the e5 square at the moment. So black tries to play bishop f6 here, but the author says there is really not much else you can do. If you take on f4, we're going to take back with the bishop. We are probably threatening to play e5 now. And if you go g5, we're going to retreat with bishop e3. And, well, the tension is pretty unpleasant for black. And the author says, let's say bishop f6, even something like takes, just a move like knight e4. And, well, you can take an e3, but we're going to take back. And you can't really sort of move the bishop away because the g5 pawn will be hanging. And you're just going to end up with us taking there and the g5 pawn being weak. And there's nothing positive to say about the black position. So black tries to play the move bishop to f6. It's quite logical. It wants to take back and try to control the dark squares like this. But Sargsakhian plays very energetically. He exchanges on e5 and then just the move bishop to f4. He's just trying to sort of swap off the only good piece black have in this position. And while these knights are on g8 and g7 on design, well, we'll see they are much worse placed than the two white knights in this position. The author says that maybe black should play something like knight f6, but it's just strategic defeat. Here, you're going to have weak pawns on e5 and c5, and the computer says after queen e3, white just have a massive advantage here. What black does is logical. He takes on f4, and after knight takes f4, he plays fe4. He's sort of hoping that if you take back on e4, maybe, well, let's say you can try something like bishop f5 and maybe exchange here and then bring the knight into f6. You're still worse, but Sargsakhian does a move that basically finishes off the strategic battle. He plays the move g4. It controls the square on f5, and, well, white is going to play knight takes e4 next, and he's going to have beautiful pieces, while black is just extremely sort of passive and has nothing positive to say at all. Well, white is winning by now already. There is also even a tactical problem that after knight f6, it's possible to play knight takes g6, and in this position after queen h6, there seems to be no reasonable way to defend. Let's say knight to h7, you can play the move knight takes e4, and sort of the combined threats of taking there with knight g5 means that black cannot not hold on. And, well, again, you see this bishop is just sort of standing idle, doing nothing to sort of help the game. After g4, black played e3, but it makes very little sense. The game was rook takes e3, bishop d7, knight e4, threatening on d6, black's defense, and, well, a nice ending will happen, so let's just see that. He plays this move, it threatens knight takes g6 followed by rook takes f8, so black goes away. There is the move knight g5, it actually threatens mate in one move. Rook e7 happens, and now, well, this nice forced sequence. Knight f7 check takes, and now he sacrifices like this and plays the move rook takes f7. Materially speaking, you can argue that black is not doing too badly. He has two knights for a rook. But the difference is in the strength of the pieces. And the main problem is that, well, there is knight c3 followed by queen c3 followed by queen takes g7 mate. And there's no reasonable way to defend this. So black resigned here. But this game makes a very powerful impression on me. Perhaps because black does everything I was told black should do in the check Benoni. But, well, white just have a nice central space edge and continues extremely logically. So even in this position where black actually, well, managed to push the white pieces back, we see that f5, the supposed counterplay, is actually punished severely by f4. And, well, the white pieces are much more active to sort of deal with the central tension. And this ended just up incredibly nice for white. Of course, there is nice details. Let's say this move g4, which sort of protects the f5 square and recaptures on e4 next. But this is more like the icing on the cake. The strategic battle has been decided already. So another warning, a final warning, I would rather say, because this is the last game of, well, while this structure does give a solid impression, it also has huge long-term problematics. So, well, we have gone around the warnings in this chapter. So if you're going to do it anyway, then it's going to be on your sort of own risk. Don't come back and say we didn't warn you.